Now we're at the part of the story where we get to talk about this young man, Stanley Lieber, born in 1922. In 1940, having recently graduated from that same Bronx high school, DeWitt Clinton, that so many other people we've talked about went to, Stanley needed a job. He needed a regular job. It just so happened that his cousin, Jean, Jean, was Martin Goodman's wife. It also just so happened that Stanley's uncle, Robbie Solomon, who was his mom's brother, also worked there for Martin Goodman at Timely. Stanley said later that his uncle Robbie was a minor executive. Joe Simon, who was the editor, 26-year-old Joe Simon, remembered it differently. He remembered Uncle Robbie, as everyone called him, as being basically there to take messages and to change the cushions and make sure they were fluffed up nicely for Martin Goodman's behind. Other people remembered Uncle Robbie as mainly being there as Goodman's spy to report on what everyone was doing. Anyway, Solomon approached Joe Simon and asked him to give his nephew a shot. Stanley remembered having seen an ad in the paper, but there's nothing to say that both those things didn't happen. Simon remembers Uncle Robbie saying to him, essentially, just keep him out of the way. And Simon, who wasn't really all that excited about the whole thing, figured, what's one more Martin Goodman relative going to matter one way or the other? So Stanley got the job at Timely Comics. The job was being a gopher, so running for coffee, essentially, doing odd jobs, chores, filling the ink pots for the authors, and coming along sometimes behind the inkers with an eraser to erase whatever pencil lines were left over from the pencilers. Well, eventually Stanley, who had a dream of being a novelist someday, eventually he had his first shot to get into print with issue 3 of Captain America in May 1941. So his story was not a script for Jack Kirby to draw, but rather it was a 2-page, really short story text. And the reason for that is that there was a requirement, there was a rule that if you had at least 2 pages of text, then you could get a cheaper mailing rate for your magazine. So they would stick in these little 2-page stories just to save a couple of pennies on mailing out subscriptions. So Captain America Foils the Traitor's Revenge was Stanley Lieber's first comic story. And as you can see, his byline is not Stanley Lieber. He said that he hoped someday to write a novel and he didn't want to ruin his name by being associated with comic books. But on the other hand, a whole lot of Jewish Americans in the entertainment business, as we've seen just in the comics business, changed their names to sound less Jewish. Anyway, Stanley Lieber became Stan Lee. And this story, although it was just a 2-page kind of filler story, is significant for another reason, because it was the first time Captain America threw his shield, which kind of became a convention starting after that. In October of that year, there was another significant first for Stan, who by that time was scripting the main stories, not just writing the filler. And that significant first is he created his first character, the Mighty Destroyer, quote, the sensational fighter of dictators, who had a pretty spiffy outfit, you have to admit. Well, remember, the guy in charge, the editor, was Joe Simon, and Jack Kirby was on staff. Simon was doing most of the writing. Now Stan was doing some of the writing as well. And not long after the first appearance of the Mighty Destroyer, there was a big change at the Timely offices. And the change had to do with Simon and Kirby having a suspicion that in the long run they were not going to they were going to be cut out of the really large profits that Captain America was bringing to the company. Now, there had only been a few issues. I think there had been 10 issues at this point, and it was selling about 500,000 copies a month, which was nothing to sneeze at, certainly. So they were making, Simon was making $85 a week for being the editor and doing most of the writing. Kirby was making $75 a week for doing a good bit, although not all, of the artwork. And they started shopping around secretly, although it kind of became an open secret. And they met with the people over at National Allied Publications, alias DC Comics. And the DC people offered them each $500 a week, which they took. They took that and left. And Martin Goodman, who was pretty upset, essentially told them not to let the door hit them on the way out. So they went over to DC Comics, where their first DC project was called Boy Commandos. Remember how I mentioned before they like to have the groups of teenage boys off having adventures. So that leaves a bit of a problem, right? Because Joe Simon was the editor and one of the only writers. So this led to Stan Lee, who, by the way, this is January 1941. He's been working there for only a few months. January 1942. So he's been working there a little over a year. He winds up being the editor of Timely Comics and the main writer. And he would be the editor. Well, he wouldn't be the editor for very long because he wound up getting drafted, actually, just 4 or 5 months after that. And then he was off in the military for 3 years. But after he got back, he would be in that job for decades. Actually, I should take just a moment to clarify something. I said that Stan Lee created the Destroyer. That was the first character he created. It was actually the first character he co-created, which is really what he did with all the characters, right? Because in every case, it was a collaboration between him as the writer and the artist. And depending on the title or the character or the time period, one or the other may have been more involved. Now, this particular case, who the artist was, we know there were 2 artists involved with the issue where the Destroyer appeared, but we don't know which one designed that spiffy outfit or was the first one to draw it. We know that the cover was drawn by Alex Schomburg, who actually drew most of Marvel's covers from, well, throughout the 1940s to the end of 1946. And the interior story was penciled and inked by Jack Bender. So Stan Lee and Alex Schomburg and Jack Bender would probably be the most fair way to put it. And I should mention just a little bit about those 2 guys before we go on. As I mentioned, Alex Schomburg did most of the Timely covers, actually, from January 1940 through September of 1946. He was born Alejandro Schomburg. His father was of German descent and his mother was Puerto Rican. And in fact, he was born in Puerto Rico, and his parents moved the family to New York City when he was a kid. He got his start painting science fiction pulp magazine covers for Hugo Gernsback. Then in the beginning of 1940, started work as a comic artist, doing again those covers at Timely. as well as covers occasionally for other companies as well. After the late 40s, he sort of retired from the comic book business, but he didn't retire completely from painting. In fact, he just shifted his focus away from comic books and back to where he had started, which was painting covers for science fiction magazines and science fiction novels. As I mentioned, Alex Schomburg did most of Timely Comics covers from January 1940 actually through September 1946. He was born Alejandro Schomburg. His father was of German descent and his mother was Puerto Rican, and he was born in Puerto Rico. His parents moved the family to New York City when he was little. In the late 1930s, he started painting pulp science fiction magazine covers for Hugo Gernsback. Then in 1940, he got into the comic book business, going to work for Timely. He did... Jack Bender was from Austria-Hungary. At least that's where he was born. When he was 8 years old, his family immigrated to Chicago. He also got his start in the 1930s, although several years earlier than Schomburg, by painting covers and doing artwork for pulp fiction magazines of various kinds. Then in the late 30s, I think around 1937, he went to work for the Harry A. Chesler comic syndicate. And 1940, he started working for various, well, not only Timely, but also he did work for Fawcett and for Lev Gleason, where he's the guy who actually created that Daredevil character that keeps popping up, who was then taken over the second issue by Jack Cole, who changed his look and his color scheme, and then after a few issues, Jack Cole was replaced. And Charles Biro would be drawing Daredevil for the rest of his run and would be the artist most closely associated with him. Anyway, 1942, Jack Bender started his own comic studio. He employed people including Gil Kane, Carmine Infantino, and Bill Ward, all names that we'll be hearing again. His studio was closed down in 1946, and he kind of sporadically did some comics art after that, and by the 1950s had turned his attention to commercial art. Bender had a younger brother, by the way, named Otto, who was a comics and science fiction writer. He started writing for science fiction pulps in the 30s. Then in the early 40s, went to work writing for Fawcett. And in fact, throughout the 1940s, that's mostly where he worked. He wrote more than half of all the different Captain Marvel stories that were written in the 40s. And also co-created Miss America for Timely. After Fawcett went under in the 50s, he went to DC and wrote Superman, not just the comic Superman, but the various titles that Superman appeared in for many years afterward. Anyhow, let's get back to Stan Lee. Here's how most of us remember him, like this, or maybe in his many movie cameos in the Marvel movies. Here's how he appeared during the time we're talking about now, during World War II. And this is how he looked just a few years later, 1947, when he was 25 and looking quite urbane and sophisticated. But this is how I remember him from when I was a kid in the 1970s. A look that was captured pretty well in his final movie cameo in Avengers Endgame. And here's how else I remember him from April 1996, when I was 28 and had I think, 2 short stories and 1 magazine article published. And I had the opportunity to meet Stan Lee, my family and I, at the Great Escape comic shop in Nashville, where he was signing autographs with the Punisher looking over his shoulder, as you can see. And I was able to meet with him and make the preliminary contact to be able to set up a couple of interviews that I was able to conduct with him over the phone. Him in his Hollywood office, and I in my little trailer out in the woods at that time, actually. So I had the opportunity to talk to him about his Western comics specifically, which we will be looking at that genre in some detail later on. But a lot of folks know him only for his superheroes and not for the many Western characters he co-created, some of which endured for 25 or 30 years. It was at that time that I learned about his connection to Black Rider. Remember, I showed this once before when I was talking about the Red Circle, the Martin Goodman-owned pulp magazines, one of which was the Black Rider. This isn't a pulp magazine. This is actually a comic book. Black Rider became a timely comic. And this is from 1950, I think March 1950. And the cover model there may look vaguely familiar. That's also a way to remember Stan Lee. Stan Lee had only been the editor and head writer at Timely for about 6 months when he was drafted into the U.S. Army in the summer of 1942. He never went any further in his service than New Jersey, by the way. He was assigned to the Signal Corps and initially to repairing telegraph poles. But someone got word that he was in the comic book business as a civilian, so it was assumed he was a cartoonist, and he was sent to the training film division where he spent most of the war. The training film division headed up by Hollywood director Frank Capra. And while there, Stan Lee worked with such cartoonists as Charles Addams, creator of the Addams Family, and Theodore Geisel, alias Dr. Seuss. Will Eisner, you'll remember, had also gotten drafted. He wound up spending the war illustrating instruction manuals and doing cartoons for posters. Joe Simon, on the other hand, didn't wait to get drafted. He joined the Coast Guard and eventually wound up working at the Coast Guard as a cartoonist, as an illustrator, putting together a promotional comic book to encourage kids to join the Coast Guard when they grew up. Jack Kirby, meanwhile, wound up in the 11th Infantry, where his division landed in Normandy after D-Day as part of the reinforcements, but then fought their way through France and into Belgium and the Netherlands and into Germany in the Battle of the Bulge. So remember the story about the creation of Captain America and the protesting Nazis down on the street, and how Jack Kirby had to be held back from just leaping into the midst of them. Well, he got his chance. Also assigned to the Signal Corps, George Baker, who was from Chicago. He was a cartoonist. He had gone to art school. He had worked as a commercial artist, and then he had worked at Disney Studios starting in 1937. In 1941, he was drafted, and he also wound up in the Signal Corps and assigned to making training manuals, animation for them, and so forth. And he created a character called Sad Sack that was sort of the star attraction of the Army Weekly magazine, Yank. Now, Sad sack is one of those military expressions. It is short for sad sack of shit, which is a totally bumbling, useless, and inept person. Sad sack for short. And that is the sort of character that Sad Sack was. And this was very popular. The Army actually took several of the cartoons that had originally appeared in the magazine and released them in a paperback near the end of the war. When the war was over, then Baker returned to civilian life and started a Sad Sack newspaper strip in 1946 that in 1949 also became a comic book from Harvey Comics. And these were still coming out into the 1980s. I remember them when I was a kid. And all the way up until Baker's death in 1975, he was doing the cover for every issue. He wasn't doing the writing or the pencils inside, but he was still involved right up until he died. Now, that came out in comic book form in 1949. In 1950, a similar character was introduced to comic strips by Mort Walker, Beetle Bailey. So Beetle Bailey and Sad Sack are virtually indistinguishable. Beetle Bailey is a Sad Sack. This one also became a comic book as well as a comic strip. The comic books don't come out anymore and have not for a long time, though they too, I think, were coming out into the 80s. But the comic strip as of 2020 is still running. Stan Lee being drafted presented Martin Goodman with basically the same problem that Joe Simon quitting had left him with, and that is when you've got one person who is not only the editor but doing most of the writing, what do you do when they're suddenly gone? Well, in this case, there was a bit of a transfer. Vince Fago, the son of Italian immigrants, had been working for Timely for a while in the Funny Animal comics, and that was where his sensibilities lay. And he wound up taking over for Stan Lee while he was gone, in part in hopes that he would bring some of his sense of humor to the superhero books and maybe lighten them up a little bit. When Lee got back in 1945, Fago relinquished the reins and did a little bit more writing. Within a couple of years, though, he had taken over the Peter Rabbit comic strip. Much like in other industries, the fact that so many writers, artists, and editors were now in uniform, even if they were in uniform being writers and artists and editors for the U.S. government, expanded some opportunities for women in the comics field. And there were several. They were a minority for sure, but we're going to take a look at just a handful of examples of women who were working just at Timely Comics during the war years. And this does not count letterers and colorists, of which there were several. We'll start with Dorothy Roubicek, who was an editor at Timely and did some writing. She was at Timely for several years, and then she did some work for EC, and finally a lit at DC, where she was the first woman to be an editor at DC Comics, starting in the late 1940s. She was an assistant editor on Wonder Woman and was also the first female writer to ever be a Wonder Woman scripter. While she was an editor at the Superman books, among other things, she met her husband, Bill Woolfolk, who scripted a lot of Superman stories in the 50s. And the way they met was her turning down a pitch for a Superman story from him. What she did not turn down, though, was the idea, actually There's some confusion as to whether this was her original idea or whether it was something inspired by the Superman radio show. But the idea of kryptonite. She thought that Superman was kind of boring because he was invulnerable and that he should have some special vulnerability. And she was the editor for the story in which Bill Finger, Batman co-creator, even though he got no credit and no royalties for it, Bill Finger scripted the story that she edited, where kryptonite was introduced to the comic books. Later on, after she had kind of gone into retirement, after she got married, had a couple of kids, but when she was in her 60s, she came back to DC as an editor in the 1970s. And at that point, she was very much a feminist. And under her editorial direction, Lois Lane became very much a feminist, which led to a large number of male fans writing letters to the letters page excoriating the uppityness of Lois Lane all of a sudden, with all of her women's lib ideas, and Roubicek wound up getting fired. Pauline Loth was an artist. She was an artist, and along with Otto Binder, the co-creator of Miss America, and she drew most of Miss America's adventures. Marcia Snyder was also an artist. She did work not only for Timely, but for several publishing houses. Her the work she's most closely associated with was Camilla, Queen of the Jungle, which was from Fiction House Publishing. She was as Fago recalled her, she always dressed in men's clothes and lived in Greenwich Village with her girlfriend, whose name was Mickey. And Fago said that even at the time, during World War II, he had not really cared about the fact that she was a lesbian, because it was none of his business, and she produced good work. Now, also, LGBTQ, I'm not sure if she was, I think bisexual might be the best description for Patricia Highsmith, although most of her relationships seem to have been with women. She was a writer. She was in her early 20s when she got started at Timely, and made a huge national splash in 1950 with her first suspense novel, Strangers on a Train, which was made into a now classic film by Alfred Hitchcock the following year. So that was it for comic books so far as Highsmith went, because after that she was a noted and respected author. I don't remember if it was 54 or 55. She wrote what might have been her masterpiece, The Talented Mr. Ripley. Maybe you've heard of that. It was made into a movie almost 20 years ago now, I guess. Anyway, she moved high in literary circles, but in her early years, in her beginning, she was writing stuff like this. Another literary luminary was an editor named Elizabeth Hardwick, who came in on Tuesdays and Thursdays, I think Fago said, 2 days a week. Didn't work in the comic book part of the business, actually. She worked there for Martin Goodman's Red Circle, or whatever it was being called that week, the fiction magazines. And she went on to become a novelist and a highly noted literary critic. And there were, like I said, there were several other women. Fago spoke of one woman who was a letterer who just had one arm, and that's very mysterious. I don't know what her name was or what her story was. But there were women. We will talk later we'll look specifically at women in the industry, and we'll briefly look back at these, but we'll see some of the others as well. But as long as we're talking about timely comics during World War II and literary luminaries, not talking about women anymore, but we gotta mention this guy, Mickey Spillane, who during the war was in the Army Air Corps and was a flight instructor, and was a freelance writer. He wrote for pulp magazines, and he also wrote for the comics, Timely and several others. He did a bunch of those little 2-page text stories that were included in Timely issues of Timely Comics, so they could get a rebate on the mail. He wrote about 50 of those, plus he scripted some things. But much like Patricia Highsmith, by the end of the decade, he had moved on to other things, some might say bigger and better things. In 1946, his crime novel, I, the Jury, debuted and was a huge smash. It introduced his signature character, the private eye Mike Hammer, who is one of the most famous of the pulp era and later hard-boiled detective private eye type characters. He went on to sell millions and millions of copies of his novels, and there were several Mike Hammer movies and at least 3 Mike Hammer television shows. Nonetheless, Mickey Spillane, during World War II, was also writing for stories for Buster Johnson and other timely titles. And here is where that urbane, sophisticated photograph that we saw earlier came from. The cover of Writer's Digest in November 1947, when Stan Lee was 25 years old. Writer's Digest, if you're not familiar with it, is still around, and it is an extraordinarily helpful magazine for professional writers and for aspiring writers. In fact, when I was in my early 20s and wanting to become a writer, I got a subscription in the early 90s and followed it regularly and learned all kinds of helpful things. I can't stress enough just how helpful it was. Well, Stan Lee is not only in the magazine, he's the cover story for the November issue in There's Money in Comics. And in the article that he provided, which I have just a couple of excerpts from right here that I'm not going to read because Stan Lee's voice, both literal and authorial, is difficult to successfully imitate, but it is very unique and distinct. And reading this, if you're familiar with Stan Lee at all, which you probably are, you can recognize that it's him. One thing that I find interesting about the article is this point that he put in bold. Don't write down to your readers. Quote, it is common knowledge that a large portion of comic magazine readers are adults, and the rest of the readers who may be kids are generally pretty sharp characters. So that's some good advice right there, I think. You know, I learned the words implacable and ubiquitous from the Fantastic Four, because Dr. Doom was implacable and his robots were ubiquitous, and that sent me scrambling to a dictionary. So I wasn't being written down to, and as a kid, that was encouraging me really to expand my vocabulary and my horizons. The Writer's Digest story was immediately expanded into a short book, and I mean immediately expanded. Now, it didn't reprint the article word for word. It actually sort of simplified and made more casual, although that's kind of hard to imagine because it was pretty casual. And it was sort of drawn and laid out similar to a comic book, and it had an introductory, some introductory information about Stan Lee, who, quote, has been in complete charge of more comic magazines than any other living editor. In the many years Stan Lee's been an editor, he has received thousands of letters, etc., etc. So you see, Stan Lee knows what he's writing about, and you know that what Stan Lee writes is true. So the booklet then goes forward and sort of describes the whole process of the creation of a comic book, and it gives some examples, kind of step by step, and then finally at the end, you've got Stan Lee with a closing message in which he says, now you've met many comic strip artists and writers, but don't let our friendship end with the close of this book. Write to me. Tell me what you thought of this book and what you think of our favorite comic strips. I'd enjoy hearing from you. So, very informal, very casual, very sort of open, kind of chummy. It's almost like, you've got this individual who's an editor for a major comic book company giving you personally a guided tour of the offices and of the process, and it's almost like he's talking directly to you and making you feel like part of the process and establishing this sense of rapport between you, the reader, and him individually and his company. Now, this is very much a preview of how Stan Lee is going to make Marvel Comics in the 1960s the huge, huge phenomenon that it became. And you can see 20 years earlier that he was already displaying the knack for knowing how to do that and doing that effectively, much more effectively probably than representatives from other companies could have done. So he's creating a public persona and a face to go along with a faceless company.